Right, folks, this episode is going to be a little different than what you might be used to. And the reason for that is this was done in collaboration with my good friend Elam Kallov. Now, Elam is building the podcast The Modern Marco Polo. He's been a very close friend of mine since a very young age, and we decided to record a few of these episodes together just because the guest was too good, and we didn't want to pass upon the offer to do it together. So this is not going to be the case for all of these, but his channel is going to be linked down below. He does a bit of a different format. He doesn't focus on fundraising or venture capital specifically, but he interviews a lot of people that he thinks is fascinating. He has the goal of personally becoming the next Marco Polo and traveling the world and talking to really interesting people, kind of like Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan. So make sure to give him a follow. And yeah, this is our interview together. Enjoy. Tammy, thank you so much for joining us. We'll start off with like a very brief intro of you. I think you're probably one of, like we were super excited. We were like thinking about this for like a month. That's how excited we were. Because I mean, you're one of the unique people who've got experience building companies, but you also have been on the other side of the table as like a VC investor. You've been at Sequoia. You've got your own Pebblebed, your own venture capital fund now with your amazing partners. So you're a very unique guest in that sense. If you don't mind, if you could give like a very short intro of like the coolest parts about your career and who you are, that'd be awesome.
Oh, the coolest part about Pebblebed today is the people I get to surround myself with. You mentioned my partners are awesome. I'm obsessed with them. I think they're some of the most brilliant, but also good people in their world and incredibly open-minded, incredibly kind. And it's rare to find that intersection of, both brilliance from an intellectual sense, but also brilliance from a character sense, coming together in one person, let alone three of them, in one space. So I'm very, very grateful for that. But also our founders are very much like in that shape of person, right? A little bit neurotic in whatever they're obsessed about, which I also love, but also very good people, very brilliant people. And I try to be the dumbest person in the room so that I'm always learning, and I think I've succeeded in that with Pebblebed.
That's awesome. I mean, it's what you said in your blog post about like the kind of people you've gone to work with is so important because I think with like Steve Jobs' biography, everyone now thinks like they have to be like mean and they got to be ruthless and be yelling at people. But when you push back against and say like you can have a great character, like a solid character, and also be smart and brilliant, like that's I think a very important message. The first question I want to get us started over here with is you've been on, as I said, both sides of the table. You've been the person making the decisions, writing the checks, and you've been the person asking for the checks. What do you, when you look at the founders around you and you look at their approach to fundraising, what are some like the most common mistakes you see being made? What are some things like you're like, oh, I wish they wouldn't be doing that. It's like killing their chances.
I think it obviously depends on like the stage, the founder, the company, the market. I think one thing people don't realize early enough, is that your investors are kind of your partners, right? And they should be there for the long run, for the next 10 years or more of your journey. And so it's a little bit like courting, it's a little bit like marriage. Like not all money is the same. The kind of person that gets attached to that money matters a lot and can influence the trajectory of your company quite a bit. Like even early on, I was fortunate to have a couple of institutional investors for my startup. I also had angel investors, and I leaned a lot on my angel investors in the early days because they were all founders before. And so drawing from the experience, and there's a lot of micro decisions that you don't see from a VC perspective, like which provider do you use for billing, right? Which like tax provider do you use? How do you fire someone? When is the right time to fire someone? There's a lot of those that stack up, and like learning from those lived experience from the investors that I had was incredibly helpful. I think having a mix is really helpful, but first and foremost, like are these people who you trust to be your partners when shit hits the fan? Oh, pardon my French. That you'd be willing to go to them, right? And they will actually help you out with the rough patches.
Absolutely. Elam, do you want to go ahead with the next question?
Sure. Yeah. Something else was also interesting was I saw on your LinkedIn profile you were a second-man business and strategy for credit, and you work directly with the founder, and it's like one of the most like successful like unicorn startups coming from India. What would you say you learned about? I mean, if you can't talk about it with Kunal Shah, like how he goes about working as a CEO of such a big startup. and things you've learned about managing large teams from him.
Yeah, I don't know if I can comment very smartly about that because I was working with him more on like a SWAT kind of team rather than managing the company. I did get a glimpse on how it's run. I think one thing that struck me was that one of the all hands, and I think that time the company was about 100-ish people, and then they had a roasting session, and people were roasting each other, including Kunal. And for how much respect and accomplishment he's had, and he has a huge following, right? He's a little bit of a celebrity, not maybe not a little bit. He's quite a celebrity in the startup ecosystem, but his team, his employees are willing to do that. I think that shows you the kind of open culture that they have in Cred, which I was like very pleasantly surprised by. I think with Kunal, if you see his tweets and his podcast and all of that, he has an incredibly deep sense of what makes people tick. And you see that in the company he's built, right? Cred is in such an interesting platform that taps into, what drives people's cortisol, and then how do we turn that into dopamine hits, right? And use that to create a behavior platform, not just like it's not just about paying your credit card bills. It's become your lifestyle for anything that touches your financial side of your things. And that just doesn't only show up in his product; it shows up in how he thinks about people, like how he talks to people.
Mm.
Even when he was guiding me, he also became an angel investor for my startup as well. He's always thinking about what is the underlying psychological driver, and can you understand that first before you decide on the plan or a strategy or decision. And that was incredibly helpful for me.
Ella mentioned you went on to work with Cred, and then from there you went to obviously what we all know Sequoia Capital. I want to ask you a little bit about your experience there, because I mean that's like the firm everyone wants a check from and everyone dreams of it, and you got to see the inside of it, which is really cool. So what I want to ask you is, there are a lot of firms out there, some successful, some very successful. What is it about, have you noticed, of Sequoia's approach to founders and going about evaluating investment decisions that gives them this unique ability to like pick the winners, like not just like the people who do well, but like do super well and build like multi-billion-dollar businesses.
I can't comment on Sequoia specifically. They're pretty careful about who talks about what they do, unfortunately. I can tell you about the people I've worked with in Sequoia Capital. Shailendra is the head of the India and Southeast Asia team, and now it's called Peak 15. I have a huge amount of respect for him. He's incredibly entrepreneurial. When he started out investing in Southeast Asia, there was no other kind of global venture capital firm that had, really set foot in that market. I don't think like even the other folks across the other sides of Sequoia in China and US really knew what Southeast Asia was and what it was capable of, and he pushed for it, coming out of India and then expanding there. And I think it's that willingness to take risks themselves and that kind of entrepreneurial spirit that lends themselves to empathy and understanding with their founders. And this comes up in a lot of little ways, right? Like I remember times when, um, like the team at Sequoia, Peak 15 have taken decisions that were more founder friendly and less investor friendly because they were in it for the long run. Right? They were not trying to be penny wise and pound foolish. They knew that it was a very long term game and they'll be partnering with founders for a long time. And that's where I learned a lot about, thinking about trust as an asset and how that compounds over time. And that's more important than anything else you can do in the short term. And you sort of like specifics about a transaction. So I have a huge amount of respect for that team. I'm still in touch with them. Still hang out with a lot of them today. And so individually, the brilliant and strong character intersecting in one person and having a lot of them in one place, I think, makes for a lot of magic.
And talking about like the intersection of magic and like really great people, you already mentioned when Burke was saying that you're really excited that Pebblebed has like really great partners. I saw like one of your partners is the founding engineer of OpenAI. What do you notice about your partners and their unique skill sets? What makes them so great at what they do, and how and what are the roles in your partner? What are the roles in your firms, and how do you go about? Let me rephrasing. In what do you notice about your partners who are so talented, founding engineer of OpenAI? What do you notice about them that are different than like the average foe? Would you say?
Uh, it's slightly different for each partner, but I think a common denominator is that we're all incredibly curious, and that curiosity lets us to find and connected dots between things that people would not have thought of before. And that's important when you're building a new company and you're trying to challenge the status quo. Like when she joined OpenAI, and she can obviously talk about this better than I can, a lot of people were skeptical that they would ever succeed because they didn't have an umbrella of a large company above them. She's also the inventor of relearner flow, kind of the very first form for machine learning operations before that was even a term. And when Keith founded Facebook AI Research, like it was the second kind of industrial AI research lab in a tech company. Even before that, he was actually an AI skeptic, but after seeing the AlexNet results, he then became a believer and then built out that capability within Facebook, now Meta. And that takes guts, right? It takes the willingness to try something that could fail and putting your neck out there and fighting for something you believe in. It also takes a lot of practicality, like understanding why is this relevant to the context that you're in, right? Um, Keith was not trying to build a lab just to produce research. It's also with the context of how does this drive Facebook as a company and platform forward. Like when Pam has built, like she's built products for Stripe as well, it's always in the context of how does this build push Stripe forward. So it was never, um, for lack of a better word, like science projects, right? I mean, there will be part of it, but there's always like a clear impact that they had in
Mm.
mind. And I think it's couching that in wanting to make a difference, trying in whatever they were doing, but also having a curiosity to try different ways to arrive at that difference. I think that's where, and obviously the execution of it also has to be good, and they're brilliant, so they managed to achieve that pretty well. But I think for example, it's going to be pretty rare, I feel, to find people of their caliber um, still being incredibly interested in every single topic, right? Talking, even asking me to join them as an equal partner. They didn't know me for that long, but they, from a lot of conversations, we had a lot of deep conversations prior to that. They were open to that idea. I don't think that's obvious because I don't come from Silicon Valley. I'm the least technical of the four of us. I know a little bit of coding, but not very good. And then they were willing to, find what's the way to make Pebblebed work from the four very different personas that coalesced around it today. And that requires a little bit of creative thinking. It's not obvious just from like, here's the logo, therefore, it's not logo A plus logo B equals logo C, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Tammy, you mentioned not being from, San Francisco. I believe you're from Singapore, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Elam actually lives in South Korea, not too far away. He's wanted to go to
Oh,
Singapore
nice.
for a long time.
I,
But
thinking of, I'm actually
go
thinking of
ahead,
going to Singapore for university. Um,
Oh,
yeah.
to NUS or NTU or one of the
Uh,
others?
one of them. Yeah. I'm applying next year,
Okay,
so yeah.
nice. Nice. Well, let me know if you do, and if you have one food recommendations. That's the one thing that ties Singapore together. It's our love for food.
Tammy, what I wanted to ask you about is you've had exposure to like the venture capital ecosystem over in Singapore and a bit of Asia in general, and then now you're in the U.S. and you're running Pebblebed in the United States. There's the question in the minds of a lot of people in tech right now, and just in the world of startups is like China versus U.S. There's been a lot of tensions. There's been a lot of competition when it comes to AI and when it comes to tech. Where do you, with your unique perspective, see the kind of balance and what do you think is the future? Do you think that region has the potential to become the leading superpower? Do you see the US being able to maintain its position, especially relating to tech and startups in general? Do you think it's going to be able to maintain its competitiveness? What would you say are some of your like views on this general topic?
I'm still very bullish on China and Southeast Asia in the next 10 years. I'm a little less in the next 2, 3 years for a variety of reasons. I think we're all pretty familiar with the economic situation of China internally. In the tech ecosystem specifically, Southeast Asia has gone through a few ups and downs, and I think the exit scenarios have not been as robust as people hoped they would be. So I do think that it will take a little bit of correction for both of these markets to recover and go back onto its upward trajectory from the tech ecosystem perspective. I also think that culturally there are different strengths that each of these ecosystems have. I don't know if you've been following, but like China has been really good at putting out a lot of research. You'll see like multilingual has been a big focus because they have to, because English has been the default of the global trade. Lingua franca, but they are Mandarin speaking and they're surrounded by a lot of different languages as well, and they incorporate that into their research pretty early on. Looking at smaller and smaller models, I think they released like one big quantization recently, because like China is such a huge mobile economy, right? And so thinking like how do you deploy AI, whether it's SLMs or LLMs, into those edge devices, I think has been front of mind. I'm just speaking from completely secondary research. I haven't spoken to anyone who's currently in China for a while. And so I think there will be different branches, right, of what kinds of innovations emerge. Obviously, because like China has a lot of resources as well, they will be good at optimizing. So I think that US will still continue to be good at starting like, inventing new areas and foraying into new spaces. I think China would be good at following fast and optimizing what they learned from other markets. And then Europe is also somewhere in between, right? They've also done a lot of work in the AI space. For Singapore specifically, and I'm biased here because I'm obviously Singaporean. They're in a unique position because they are both very Western and very Eastern, both culturally, both in terms of its institutions, both in terms of its social political climate. Um, there has been quite a lot of movement of people from Hong Kong and China moving to Singapore, but of course, like Singapore has always been, on strong trade terms with like the Western markets as well. I don't have a good answer into how they're going to balance the two. Hope they do. I think there could be a unique opportunity for them to act like a broker or like a neutral ground for like conversations and partnerships between the two ecosystems. And they've been pushing really hard to build out the AI capability in-house as well. There's a chief AI officer in the government that has been recently appointed. They have a regional foundational model that they've been encouraging. I think it's NUS sponsored, but linked to the broader ecosystem based out of Singapore. And I don't think that they will be, they will beat the US or whatever just from sheer like size constraint. But I think they could be a good ground to kind of have people facilitate innovation that could potentially intersect across the two markets. But we'll see. It's still pretty early days. There's still a lot of things in flux. I used to be an econ major, but that was a long time ago. So don't take all my words with like a bucket of salt.
How about like because the new markets and stuff, everyone's just talking about AI. Would you say there's because you guys are funding technology, would you say there's other technologies outside of AI that's kind of under thought about or under represented at the moment, you think?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that AI is such a broad term, right? AI has been around. In fact, it's already got its hype cycles and troughs like since the 80s. And there are different ways to implement AI. I think right now today when people say AI, they're thinking about generative AI, but there's been classical NLP and other machine learning models that has been around for a while. And I think eventually this will be ubiquitous, right? We will have some form of AI in kind of any tech product, to the point where when we think about companies today, we don't say like, oh, buy this product because it's on the cloud, or buy this product because it has internet, right? And I think that same kind of nomenclature will appear when we talk about a company or a product, and most of the time we're talking about the value proposition is delivered, and not because they're using AI to deliver it. So I want to caveat first that like even though we're super excited about AI, I think like it's such an incredibly exciting time and historical time as well. But I wouldn't carve it out as a category separate from other types of tech products, especially in the future. So that's one thing. The second thing is that yes, we are pretty excited about a lot of other technologies. Like one of our portfolio companies, Dialypso, is a WebAssembly tooling platform. WebAssembly is a technology that has been around for a while and has been incredibly useful. Like Figma was built on top of it. But the challenge has been that the tooling around the ecosystem has been pretty nascent. And so they're filling in that gap so that's a lot more accessible, easier to deploy across the board. And so there's stuff like that that we're still pretty excited about. It doesn't need to have AI in the pitch deck for us to take a look at it. For sometimes, if it's it might even be a deterrent if your AI is plastered all over your deck and that's the only thing you can talk about. Ultimately it's about what company are you building, right? What value are you delivering? And is the technologies you choose the best way to deliver? there could be instances where LLMs don't make sense, right? It's pretty expensive today, for example. There could be things that you can do like regex to solve what they're doing for, and you don't necessarily have to use it. So it's ultimately about what problem are you solving, and are you choosing the best way to solve it.
Tammy, you work with a lot of very technical founders at Pebblebed. You invest in a lot of really bright minds. And, when these people start out, there's usually always a thesis around the startup they're building. There's always this kind of underlying hypothesis. And a question that's always fascinated me is when to pivot versus persist. Because when you listen to a lot of different people, some are they talk about the virtues of being very stubborn and just like stuck to your vision, saying screw you to the world, like we're going to achieve this. Whereas some will say, oh, if you see certain market signals, you should pivot. Obviously with technical products, especially like hardware, like really deep tech, that's even more important to know, like, is it worth doing this, or are we wasting our time here? What are your some insights on, like, when a founder should know to be stubborn versus when a founder should know to just change their minds and go iterate or pivot?
I'm gonna give a disappointing answer of it depends again, because I do think it's very contextual to. There are two things I think you need to have before you can decide whether or not to pivot. One is an incredibly clear self-awareness of who you are, what your strengths are, why you're doing this. Right? I think if you fall into building a company because you want someone else's validation, that's never going to be a recipe for success. That can help drive it. People with a chip on their shoulder might have like a little bit more rage, a little bit more fuel to move forward. But when things really when things get really tough, like what motivates you, and does that motivation maintain regardless of what's happening in that company or in that market? And so I don't know if I felt like being a founder was an incredibly like self-awareness journey, knowing like who you actually are, what really motivates you, and from then you can then decide like, is this something you want to stick to, or is this something you want to pivot on? I think the second thing to think about is being clear that you are not in love with the solution, but you are in love with that problem. And maybe, you might pivot on that problem later on, but there are micro pivots that can happen even before that, that might lead you to the direction you want to. If you're not completely tied or stubbornly tied on, the solution you dream up. Maybe you have this like super sexy like invention that you have, but it actually doesn't solve the customer's need, and then you end up trying to be a hammer looking for a nail. I think that's problematic. People might prove me wrong, but that's harder, I think. And that's when you should do micro pivots, and you might end up still staying in the same market. You just might have a different approach. But then, you always have the stories of like how Slack started as a game, and all of that. So I think when you understand who you are and what you're doing, and when you know that you are not tied to a particular solution just for the sake of it, that's when you can make a better decision about whether or not you need to pivot. No
But
worries, no
continuing,
worries.
yeah. But continuing on, I guess this is a more like broad question. I mean, you graduated from Cornell and you've had like a long career, first as an intern and then to working for Sequoia and then your current venture. What would you say for people who are young founders like us at the moment, or people who want to be founders, or who want to be venture capitalists, investors? What would you say are your advices on how they should go about the current changing landscape of things, especially with AI and those things as well added?
People who want to be founders or people who want to be
Yeah,
investors? Because I think those are two different
founders,
paths.
I guess. Yeah, so
Founders
I guess
first?
founders first.
Well, Tammy, we'll divide into two. Like, let's do founders first. So you're a young 18-year-old, you're maybe going to college, or you're scrapping college. You're just saying, I'm starting. What's the advice for like people who want to be founders? And then let's like divide into two pieces. And the second part is like venture capitalists and people who want to work in this kind of, venture capital firms, etc.
Um, I think the starting point should be similar, which is just build stuff, right? Get stuff in the hands of people, get feedback, learn, and it doesn't have to be successful, it doesn't have to be sexy, but you learn so much just from putting something out there and having people respond to it. And I think that's what will guide you both in your founder journey. And if you eventually want to become an investor, it helps you a lot with thinking about evaluating companies and supporting companies after. I think this might be the Asian culture in speaking, but I think tactically, being in VC and being in an investor role tends to be a narrowing of options or like a deepening of options rather than broadening. And it was like something I got advice from when I moved to Sequoia. which is that, if most of your career is in investment, it's going to be really hard to move out of that role unless you're joining like a portfolio company. That's why you see a lot of investors like either start up or join a portfolio company or hop around other funds or start their own funds. And it's going to be hard to be like, hey, hire for a CPO role for some other company who has no prior relationship with you and all they see is that you've done investments. Because I do think there is an overlap in skill set, but it's not entirely the same. And there's a lot of things like, for example, people management, right? A lot of VC firms are small, and so you don't actually learn to like how do you manage 100% team, a 200% team. I think that's a different exposure that you won't get for the most part for most VC models. I know there are new stuff emerging out there. So technically, if you want to be a VC, just be cognizant that if you start very early and you stay a long time in that role, that is committing a lot more to the VC role than if you started in a more generalist like strategy, product, or engineer role or technical PM role. I think the doors that open are a lot broader, even if they're not as deep, if that makes sense. But regardless, I do think start with building a network and start with just shipping things and getting it out there and learning from them.
Absolutely. Ellen mentioned Cornell, and I want to ask you a bit of a personal question here because this is something that
Sure.
we have both gone back and forth on a lot. Like, I'm more of the type of like scrap college and let's just start building immediately. Like, let's screw all that. Like, that's always an option. Whereas Ellen, he's thought a bit more about applying, going, and then maybe dropping out like a lot of the successful founders do. We've got another
Yeah.
friend who's like, let's just go to college and let's finish it out. I want to ask you, you're exposed to a lot of different founders on a day-to-day basis. A lot of them go to nice schools as well. I mean, MIT, they stand for a lot of these really, really nice schools. What do you think the future hold? I mean, you've also seen AI, the way it's progressing, how it's affecting education. If you were a young person today, how would you go about thinking education? How would you go about thinking about college? Do you think it's worth it? Do you think it should still always be on the table? What do you think?
I think you should still consider it for sure. I think the question is like what do you want to learn? I think some people want to go to school for the logo, and I was kind of one of them. I think what I'm doing now has very little to do with a little bit of economics, but I was an English literature major as well, and that's still a personal passion of mine. But it's not like I'm writing poetry in my investment memos. But I loved it, right? So I wanted that academic exposure to literature, and I don't regret having done that. But I wasn't doing it so to get a job or so to like do something as a result of that, the specific degree. And so being again, it goes back to self-awareness, like being clear as to what you're looking for. Um, I do think like some people know very early on what they want to do, some people don't, and it's okay to explore a little bit. And so finding a platform that gives you a lot of optionality, allows you to experiment a bunch. And so technically, what that meant for my personal journey was that initially I had wasn't planning to just be an English major, and I had scholarships from UK schools. And the UK system is different from the liberal arts system in the US. And the UK system is very much like your courses just have to be that major, and if you wanted to take other classes in other majors, you had to apply for a different degree if your degree didn't already capture it. Versus in Cornell, I could take literature, I could take economics, I took Python. That was my first introduction to programming. I could take anthropology of food, and that gave me a lot of experimentation that I would not have been able to access, especially not in Singapore, where the cultural context is a little different from the UX. So it has to start from like where you are, what you want to learn, what you have access to at the point in time, and what you want to get out of college. Another example is like people always think about, should I do an MBA? And I think a lot of people want to do MBA because they think it gives them like a better chance of getting a job. And yes, that's true, but again, be aware, right? Like I think MBAs are good if you want to access a network you don't already have access to. You want to change a geography that you don't really have access to. Unfortunately, visas is still a very real thing. Or you want to change industries entirely, right? But if I was like a VC, I wanted to go MBA and then go back to VC. I don't know if I would learn that much from an MBA unless there was something very specific about that particular program that I want to get out of it. So again, it's about like knowing what you're doing it for and knowing what doors or experiments this lets you do to figure out which direction you want to go after. Um, it feels so funny to give this advice because I still think like I'm 15. I know I'm getting old now. But I can remember like what I felt when I was like 17, 18 and starting college, how I felt after. and what I wish I knew now. And the only thing I wish I did more of was just experiments. Like I wish I
Tammy,
tried more different things.
you mentioned
One
taking an anthropology of food class
Yeah.
at first. What, what was that like?
Super interesting. Look, like I come from Singapore, which is so tiny that a lot of us travel just because like this, you can drive across the country in half an hour. So there's not much to do. It's not like the US where every state is like a different country. And I worked a lot of my career in Southeast Asia across like six different markets, six different cultures, six different languages. So I've always been really interested about how things map across and how do you compare development across different cultures and markets. And so food anthropology was an interesting way to think about how does our cuisine reflect either cultural norms or material environments of the culture that it came from. Like for example, if you look at like there's always something that makes a meal feel like a meal. So in Asian culture, a lot of times that is some form of starch, like rice. If you had like, usually like let's say Chinese, you have rice, you have meat, you have vegetables, right? If I were to take out the rice and only eat meat and vegetables, it does not feel like a meal to me because that's not what I grew up with that kind of concept of a meal. But take my husband who's Spanish and he would eat like meat and cheese, and that's a meal for him, right? And that's like it doesn't like it's like cognitive dissonance for me that they call that a meal. And so those was like a it's more of like a curiosity thing, just being like, how do other people think about their food? What does it mean for them? How is that like a vehicle for communicating traditions and values or building up like social ecosystems, so that kind of thing.
This is super random. I'm just curious because I was learning about food anthropology actually 3 days ago, a little bit. Super. I was learning about how uh, if you look at most of Asia, they say tea is chai, right? And then if you see a lot of the coastal countries around the world, you say tea because
Yeah,
from in China, most yeah, I found that really interesting. But I guess
yeah, yeah,
go,
yeah.
I guess going outside the food, you a little bit more about the school because this is something I'm interested about. You said Singapore is very like it's kind of like in between like kind of the conservativeness and not. In San Francisco, it seems like the hub of a lot of things, but it also seems to have gotten the prices, everything is up. So would you say for young founders who want to build, they should go to San Francisco? If they can't afford it, should they go? Or not, would you say? Or would you say Singapore is also good because you said Asia is also leading in some ways the charge?
Yeah, I do think it's worth spending time in the valley, just for the mentorship and the exposure and information that you get. I think the feedback loops in Silicon Valley are so tight that you learn so quickly. And in the early days of building a company, rate of learning is a huge driver to your success, right? And I think the mentorship that you can get, the talent you get access to, just talking to people who've done it before, you're not gonna find some maybe China, but you won't get like the same density. And also the culture of just sharing has been built up over the last like 50 years. And I think that also contributes to how much you can learn. I don't think you necessarily have to stay there forever. If you're building like a hyper local company, there will be things that will never apply to your market, right? Like I think in the US, what's so bizarre to me is that ACH can take 2 business days. Right? And then in India, you have UPI where you have instant bank to bank transfers. So there's a different infrastructure. But at the same time, of course, the maturity of some of the other infrastructure in the US is very different from India. And you trickle that down to like the other markets. And so don't blindly copy paste. Even like in Southeast Asia, there were some companies that were trying to copy paste models from China, and it didn't work because they didn't understand the context of their local environment. But I think the access to people, having the information, those inputs coming in, you decide what inputs you actually act on. But having the quality of information, I think is incredibly helpful as a founder.
Absolutely.
Mm.
Well, Tammy, I know this has been about, I think, 40 minutes now. We'll ask, if possible, about one or two more questions, depending on if Ellen has a follow-up question. What I want to ask about is I always like to ask founders the first ever like stages of their business because Revery, it's still, quite successful of a company. I know you left to build Pebblebed, but I want to ask a little bit about like the early days. Like, how did you? Because we've got a lot of young founders who listen to us, a lot like us. They're either in high school or they're now in college, and they're building these ideas, and they want to get traction, they want to fundraise, and they want to take over the world. But like, what are some things that you did in the early stages of Reverie to like, get traction to be able to like put in the hands of people like you said earlier in the podcast?
Yeah, I can tell you specifically what we did, which may not apply to other companies. For context, Reverie was the mission was to make mental health care accessible to anyone, and we wanted to do that through distribution of mobile apps. So we were taking cognitive behavioral therapy protocols and then mapping that to a mobile game, and then so it's like a direct to consumer in a way kind of play. And so it's not like an enterprise kind of product where you find a design partnership, you co-create something with them, you learn from them, and then you build for other companies, right? This was very much like mass, and we were targeting kind of very middle income users. We're targeting women between the age of 30 to 50 because they were very much underserved by a lot of the mental health products out there. And so what we did in the very beginning was that we launched a Facebook ad campaign even before we had the ad properly. We just took out a few of the key things we thought would resonate from the ad. We targeted the users that we had hypotheses that would resonate the most. And then, you have a few, right? And then you test them. And we only spend like, a few $100s to just test it out. And then we had friends in the paid marketing industry who knew what the benchmarks were in terms of like cost per click and click-through rates. And we wanted to make sure that the ads that we had drastically better metrics than what the industry was. Because in the early days it's obviously like you'll be better, but as you scale the metrics will go down. So it can't be just like a little bit better, right? It had to be significantly better for there even to be some sort of resonance. And then in those ads we had an email. We collected users' emails. I think we collected a few thousand. And then we ended up speaking to like 30 or 40 of them. We just like cold reached out to all of them. The conversion rate will always be low, but then some of them did respond. And then we did a call with them. We asked them like about their situation. We showed them a really shitty like MVP of the idea that we had, asked them to get their feedback on it. We recorded all of those, and then we used that actually as part of our pitch to show that people wanted the idea that we had, that there was an emotional response to the idea that they had. It wasn't just like, oh, this is cool. There was very much like you can hear the excitement, right, in the user interview's voice. And that was the initial kind of proof we had, at least for Signal, that there was something in the direction that we want to go to. And so we relied a lot on paid marketing only because we could test and be clear that the cost was manageable. I wouldn't recommend this for everything. And this is also like it's probably changed as well. Like depending on which like industry, the cost might be very different as well. So there are other ways you can be creative about it, right? Like I've had people reach out to like Facebook groups and then get people within the Facebook group to talk to them or do like surveys. And there are clever little things you can do. For example, if you say like if it's like a low income group and then it means a lot to give out like prizes, you can say things like, oh, the we'll give out randomly 5 people a $50 prize. And that actually works better than saying one person having a like $2,500 price, like because people think, okay, there's more chance of me getting. So there are little ways, as long as you understand kind of your end user, to kind of get some feedback. But I always encourage the pendulum between a gut instinct and testing that gut instinct with external data. I don't think you can one of them by itself. I don't think you can A/B test your way to PMF if you have no idea like what you're starting with. I also don't think that you just listen to yourself and never talk to any user and never iterate from any kind of feedback.
Really interesting. We're trying something similar, but with Reddit ads. We're like advertising on like smaller subreddits that are about like designing homes, and we've gotten a couple of waitlist signups. That's really cool, though. It's good to know someone's done it before us, so we're not like
Yeah,
crazy with this.
I
I
learned the mobile game side, so they do that a lot as well. Again, it all has to make sense in context of like what your LTV to CAC is, so don't do it blindly. But I found it really helpful. But I've heard like other weird things. Like I've heard of people like putting their logo in memes and putting it on Giphy, so that when people search for memes and they see the company logo, and then that's how they. So I think there's a lot of interesting hacks that you can do out there, at least for the
mm,
early like signals, and trying to do it cheap and quick.
Do you have anything that you'd like to add? I know we asked a lot of questions, but there's obviously you know yourself better and you know the insights you know better than we do. So, is there anything, literally anything about investing, about anything that you'd like to add for the audience?
Hmm. So as for the audience, I'm trying to think. One thing I've been asking my partners and people around me lately is what motivates you. And I know that sounds very fluffy, but I think it's helpful. And what I've learned about myself is that people motivate me. curiosity motivates me, but I also think that the most interesting information still lies in people's heads. And so I want to learn more, and I want to connect to smart people and like learn their internal universes. And it's guided a lot of like the work that I do, right? Like I think I try to make sure every conversation, every like interaction I have, I try to be as authentic and like helpful and open-minded as I can because of that North Star that I have. And not everyone has to do this, but being aware, again, going back to the theme of self-awareness of like what really drives you and being clear about that. And maybe what drives you is that you just want to win everything, and that's totally fine, right? But don't like pretend to be otherwise, and then you end up, pulling yourself in different directions. I think just do what you really want to do. That's for you and not for other people.